Afshin Molavi is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University. I asked him if there were any surprises in Trump's speech.
I'm actually more surprised that we don't see more speeches like this by presidents of the United States, because I've always thought that the president of the United States is not just the commander-in-chief. He is the symbol-in-chief, he's the salesman-in-chief, he's the cheerleader-in-chief. And symbol-in-chief, President Donald Trump has failed on many levels because he's lack of restraint and, personal conduct issues. But as cheerleader-in-chief, as salesman-in-chief, this was a home run speech.
He knew who his audience was.
Precisely. And when you're in front of an audience like that, you ought to be touting the American economy. You ought to be saying how my tax cuts, his tax cuts are going to bring new growth. You ought to be touting the innovative capacity and entrepreneurs in America, because these are decision makers in that audience, decision makers that could deploy billions of dollars in the United States. So I thought the speech was right on point.
He talked about free trade, open trade, did not single out China by name. While saying we're open for trade, he kind of alluded to the fact with strings attached. Let's listen to a part of what he had to say, and I want to get your reaction.
The United States will no longer turn a blind eye to unfair economic practices, including massive intellectual property theft, industrial subsidies, and pervasive state-led economic planning.
And of course, this happens the same week the administration imposed pretty hefty tariffs on China and South Korea.
That's right. And those terms are directed, in many ways at China, those terms that he used: massive intellectual property theft, industrial subsidies, et cetera. But again, just by being there at the World Economic Forum, President Donald Trump is ironically repudiating some of his anti-globalization skepticism, right? Because he's understanding sometimes where you stand depends on where you sit. When you sit in the Oval Office, you see the trade numbers, you see the investment numbers. It's not so simple. And maybe what we're seeing is the globalization education of the president taking place before our eyes.
Let me ask you a question about TPP, because he did talk about TPP. He said, and I'm quoting here, U.S. prepared to negotiate mutually beneficial bilateral agreements with countries, including those in the TPP. Let's not forget, Afshin, he withdrew from the TPP last year. So what does this mean? That it's okay to have bilateral deals with individual countries?
And that's right. I mean, the era of the multilateral trade deal in the Trump administration is over. Yeah, that's over. And so we are, he wants to negotiate these bilateral trade deals again, but these trade deals, they are onerous. They take a long time to negotiate. And at the end of the day, the United States already has pretty good trade relations with many of those TPP countries. So it's interesting how, again, in a sense, he's slightly walking back the withdrawal from the TPP by saying, no, we still want to trade with you.
Mixed messages from this administration.
Mixed messages, absolutely.
He talked about two countries in particular, which I found interesting, really the only two countries he mentioned, North Korea or DPRK, saying his maximum pressure strategy is working. He also mentioned Iran. Let's listen to that soundbite.
My administration is proud to have led historic efforts at the United Nations Security Council and all around the world to unite all civilized nations in our campaign of maximum pressure to denuke the Korean Peninsula. We continue to call on partners to confront Iran's support for terrorists and block Iran's path to a nuclear weapon.
So he wants to block Iran's, efforts to achieve nuclear weapons, but he hates the Iran nuclear deal, which is exactly what it's aimed at.
Right. No, exactly right. And he came in very skeptical of the nuclear deal, as you well know, Asieh, from the very beginning. And he thought it was full of loopholes, and it was, there were sunset clauses that would allow Iran eventually to enrich enough uranium to form the core of an atomic, all of these things that were in his mind. But frankly, the International Atomic Energy Agency has said that Iran has abided by the terms of that deal. The deal was never perfect. It was always flawed. But in his view, Iran is skirting the deal. Iran is going to find loopholes. Iran, after 10 years, is going to be able to continue to enrich uranium. And so I agree with you that it's important that these are the only two countries he pointed out. And these are the two main threats. That sends a signal to the world.
Our thanks to Afshin Molavi.